from all over the world.
Local consumer prices continue to hover at the 2% rate in April.
Turning to robots to allow the visually impaired the chance to better indulge in cultural experiences, like the number of hybrid cars are registered in South Korea has surpassed 2 million with this locally developed Yuri rocket.
Arirang. Seoul stocks rallied more than 2%, pushing them over the 9,000-point mark for the first time ever, driven by strong buying in chip makers. Despite lingering concerns over the Federal Reserve's hawkish outlook and uncertainty surrounding Iran. President Lee Jae-myung wrapped up his participation at this year's G7 summit in France and returned to Korea on Thursday after joining discussions on global economic imbalances, sustainable growth, and AI. He'll brief the nation on the outcome of his trip on Friday. The U.S. and Iran are said to have signed a ceasefire MOU earlier than expected, launching a 2-month window for nuclear talks and restoring maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. We begin with President Lee Jae-myung's return to Korea following a 10-day European tour that culminated at the G7 summit in France. He'll be briefing the nation on the outcome of the trip tomorrow on Friday. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yoo-jin starts us off.
The final day of this year's G7 summit began with the working session on reviving a balanced, shared, and sustainable economic growth for all. Speaking at Wednesday's session, President Lee Jae-myung said global economic imbalances should be tackled through dialogue and solidarity rather than blame. He also called for stronger cooperation to strengthen the resilience of global energy supply chains as the war in the Middle East has fueled concerns over oil supplies and inflation.
President Lee proposed that energy importing countries, particularly those in the Asia-Pacific region, move beyond responding individually and strengthen practical cooperation through information sharing, early warning systems, emergency coordination, and efforts to stabilize oil and petroleum product supply chains.
The session was followed by a working lunch where world leaders and tech giants discussed artificial intelligence. President Lee emphasized the importance of narrowing the global AI divide while ensuring AI remains safe, transparent, and accountable. Korea endorsed 7 of the 8 documents adopted during the 2-day meeting of the G7 members and 5 invited countries. Leading up to the G7, attention was on whether President Lee would hold a bilateral meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump on the sidelines. Although no official summit took place, the Blue House said on Wednesday that the two leaders exchanged views on the Korea-U.S. alliance and the Korean Peninsula over Tuesday's gala dinner.
President Trump reaffirmed his strong commitment to playing whatever role is necessary to advance peace on the Korean Peninsula and said he would remain in close communication with President Lee on the matter.
Posting a photo of himself with Trump on X, Lee wrote that the two had a candid 90-minute discussion that produced meaningful progress. He added that President Trump had invited him and First Lady Kim Hae-kyung to play golf. After returning to Korea on Thursday, President Lee is expected to shift his focus back to domestic affairs. On Friday, he will chair a meeting with his top aides to review the country's summer emergency preparedness. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
Seoul equities advanced over 2% today to shatter the 9,000 barrier for the first time, buoyed by optimism over semiconductor shares. Our Park Chun-han has more.
Korea's benchmark KOSPI has rewritten history. On Thursday, the KOSPI surged past 9,000 milestone, logging a jump of more than 115% in 2026 alone. With Korea's growing role in the global tech industry and rising optimism across the sector, it took only 22 trading days for the index to climb from 8,000 to 9,000. The undisputed heavyweights are the Korean semiconductor giants. Especially, SK hynix has seen its shares skyrocket, surging over 300% this year. Adding to the momentum, SK hynix on the same day announced that it has already supplied samples of its next-generation 12-layer HBM4E chips to major clients.
Recently, expectations surrounding SK hynix have strengthened amid reports of a potential ADR listing and discussions over a share buyback and retirement program worth up to 100 trillion won. As a result, the company's stock has significantly outperformed. In addition, the prevailing view in the market is that the semiconductor industry will remain in a strong upcycle through this year and next, further supporting investor confidence.
Behind the KOSPI's rally, retail investors have been a major driving force. On the macroeconomic front, the easing of geopolitical tensions has played a crucial role. In particular, the recent report of an end-of-war draft MOU between the United States and Iran. With the expected reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, crude prices have cooled to the $70 range, effectively easing inflation fears. While global investment banks are already eyeing the 10,000-point milestone, experts urge a degree of caution.
The KOSPI's rapid rise in a short period of time has raised concerns over heightened market volatility. Even minor negative developments could trigger sharp shifts in trading flows, amplifying market swings as investors rush to either buy or sell.
With heightened optimism surrounding Korean markets, the KOSPI's 10,000-point milestone is now emerging as the market's next destination. However, volatility stemming from global uncertainties, interest rate concerns, and shifting investor sentiment remains a key risk that could challenge those expectations. Park Junan, Arirang News.
In the meantime, the government is stepping up market surveillance amid heightened global volatility after the U.S. Federal Reserve left its rates unchanged while signaling the possibility of further hikes. Lee Ju-yeon explains.
The government is stepping up risk monitoring after the U.S. Federal Reserve signaled further policy tightening. At a meeting of top economic and financial policymakers on Thursday, chaired by Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance and Economy Koo Yoon-chul, officials present promise to strengthen an integrated risk management framework and take preemptive measures when necessary.
As expectations of interest rate hikes in major economies and global uncertainties, including the outlook for the AI-driven economy, continue to persist, we will maintain heightened vigilance, closely monitor market conditions, and take timely stabilization measures when necessary.
Meanwhile, Bank of Korea Senior Deputy Governor Yoo Sang-dae shared a similar view at a market conditions review meeting, urging caution over potential volatility in financial and foreign exchange markets amid persistent global uncertainties. He said a shift in the monetary policy stance of major economies is becoming increasingly apparent as central banks continue to prioritize inflation risk. Central banks worldwide are shifting toward tighter monetary policy as inflation pressure persists. The European Central Bank has raised its key interest rate to 2.25% as inflation remains above target, partly driven by continued geopolitical risk from the war in Iran. The Bank of Japan also tightened policy, lifting its benchmark rate to 1%, the highest level since 1995.
The reason why central banks are increasing the rates globally is because of the high pressure of inflation coming from the oil crisis caused by the Iran war.
Earlier on Wednesday, the U.S. Federal Reserve left its benchmark interest rate unchanged at a range of 3.5% to 3.75%, marking its fourth consecutive meeting without a rate move and the first policy decision under new chair Kevin Walsh. The Federal Reserve's latest signal has also heightened focus on the Bank of Korea's next policy move. Bank of Korea Governor Shin Hyun-song said on Wednesday that consumer inflation is expected to remain elevated for a considerable period, despite the recent decline in global oil prices. He also emphasized that the central bank will respond decisively until it is confident that inflation is on a sustainable path toward its target. 이주연, Arirang News.
The U.S. and Iran conflict may be nearing an end, raising hopes that one of the biggest energy shocks in recent years are finally beginning to ease. Now, global oil prices responded immediately, but that relief has yet to reach Korean consumers here. For more, we are joined by our economic correspondent Kim Junong tonight. Welcome, Junong.
Great to be here, Tami.
So, Junong, I filled up my car yesterday, and it looks like gas prices across the country are still pretty steep.
Right, they're quite still high. I visited a gas station in Seoul that is known for offering relatively low prices, but gasoline was still selling nearly 2,000 won, or about $1.31 per liter. Nationwide, the average price stood at around 1,600 won before the Middle East conflict, but has remained above the 2,000 won range since mid-April. Drivers I met said the high cost of fuel remains a burden.
Gasoline prices are just too high. I drive long distances for work, so fuel costs have become a major burden. I spend nearly twice as much on gas as I used to.
I never imagined diesel prices would climb this close to 2,000 won a liter. It reminds me of past economic crises.
The global oil market, however, is telling a very different story. By Wednesday, global benchmark Brent crude had dropped below $80 a barrel. U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate also fell below $80. It was the first time in more than 3 months that both benchmarks had traded under that level.
Well, Junong, there seems to be a clear gap between global oil prices and oil prices here in South Korea. When will that gap eventually begin to close?
Well, experts say there's typically a 3-week lag, and that's mainly due to the distribution process. Much of the fuel now being sold was purchased at higher prices. Here's how one expert explains it.
There are 2 stages of delay. One is between global oil prices and refiners, and the other is between refiners and gas stations selling that fuel. Altogether, it usually takes about 3 to 4 weeks for lower oil prices to reach consumers.
The bigger challenge now is getting the supply chain back on track. Oil refining and export facilities across the Strait of Hormuz were damaged during the conflict and are expected to take time to return to normal operations. Shipping has also yet to fully recover, with thousands of vessels still waiting to move through the waterway after weeks of disruption. Experts say supply conditions won't fully recover to pre-war levels until infrastructure is restored and geopolitical tensions ease. They say that process could take more than a year.
So it looks like it's going to take some time. Now, the government has been capping gasoline prices for months now. Junong, it looks like that's going to continue, right?
For now, the answer is yes. So the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Resources had been expected to announce the next phase of the gasoline price cap tonight, but instead decided to extend the current ceiling. With the ceasefire still in its early stages, officials say they'll watch market conditions a little longer before making any changes. While no timeline has been given, the government says the current measure is only a temporary extension. As a result, the price ceiling for retailers will remain at 1,934 won per liter for gasoline and 1,923 won for diesel. For consumers, the price cap has helped keep fuel prices in check for more than 3 months. Removing it too soon could push gasoline prices even higher.
There's no doubt the price cap has helped limit fuel price increases in Korea. In countries without such a policy, including parts of Europe and the United States, retail prices of gasoline nearly doubled.
Yet compensation for refiners remain a sticking point. The industry says it has suffered inventory losses by selling fuel produced for more expensive crude under the price cap. But differences over how those losses should be calculated mean negotiations are likely to continue. Meanwhile, the Finance Ministry also stepped up its response earlier today. Finance Minister Gu Yun-chul convened the Consumer Price Task Force meeting, saying the easing of immediate risks do not mean the challenges are over. He also unveiled additional support measures, including fuel subsidies and expanded discount programs to help ease the burden on households.
Well, while those additional measures are being rolled out, it looks like it's going to take some time until those effects of the conflict will ease and fade away. Junong, thanks for coming in tonight.
Thank you.
An early signing of a U.S.-Iran ceasefire pact has reportedly triggered a 60-day diplomatic push on Iran's nuclear program and cleared the way for a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Our Oh Soo-young has more.
The United States and Iran appear to have inched closer to implementing their ceasefire agreement after both sides remotely signed a memorandum of understanding aimed at ending the conflict and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. According to US officials cited by Axios, President Donald Trump signed the document on Wednesday, days ahead of a planned in-person ceremony in Switzerland. Earlier on Wednesday, the Trump administration released a full text of the 14-point memorandum agreed by Washington and Tehran, declaring an immediate and permanent end to military operations, including in Lebanon. The US will begin lifting its maritime blockade immediately, while Iran will work to restore the free movement of commercial vessels through the critical Strait of Hormuz and return shipping levels to normal. Iran will remove mines and coordinate with Gulf states on the future management of the waterway. The two sides also agreed to a 60-day negotiating period aimed at reaching a broader agreement on Iran's nuclear program. Tehran also reaffirmed that it will not develop nuclear weapons, while both sides agreed to negotiate the future of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile under the oversight of the International Atomic Energy Agency. In return, Washington is offering significant economic incentives, including sanctions relief, waivers for Iranian oil exports, and a proposed reconstruction and development package worth at least $300 billion. Speaking in France after the agreement was unveiled, Trump made clear that any economic benefits would depend on Iranian compliance. He warned that if Tehran fails to honor the agreement or refuses to reach a final nuclear settlement, Washington could resume military action.
And it's a memorandum of understanding. If it doesn't get done in 60 days, that's all right. We go back to bombing. You know, I don't want to do that because it's so good. But we might have to, because we're never going to let them have a nuclear weapon.
Trump said the deal also sidesteps a catastrophe for the global economy and renewed turmoil in energy markets. The focus now shifts to Switzerland, where US and Iranian negotiators are expected to begin talks on a comprehensive agreement covering Iran's nuclear program, sanctions relief, and regional security issues. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
In other news, the U.S. Congress is moving to allow allied countries to build non-combat Navy vessels. Our Kim Bo-kyung has the details.
The U.S. Congress is pushing a bill that would allow U.S. allies to build non-combat U.S. Navy vessels in their own countries. The Senate Armed Services Committee has reportedly included a provision in the recently approved National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2027 that would permit up to 2 bulk fuel tankers or strategic transport ships to be procured from foreign shipyards. This is expected to permit the overseas construction of non-combat vessels, but the construction would need to align with U.S. national security interests, and the contracting companies would need to make corresponding investments in the U.S. shipbuilding and maritime sectors. The House Appropriations Committee's Defense Subcommittee has also drafted a similar version of the fiscal year 2027 Defense Appropriations Bill. Scheduled for a committee review next week, the draft would narrow the scope of the ban on using funds for foreign shipbuilding from all Navy vessels to combat ships only. Although these legislative proposals are limited to allied countries and non-combat vessels, one expert says this itself gives a legal pathway for the Moscow project to be realized.
South Korea is effectively the only U.S. ally with the shipbuilding capacity to build these vessels at scale. Creating a legal pathway for construction in Korea makes the Masuga project far more feasible.
Meanwhile, the Senate Armed Services Committee voiced support for ROK-US cooperation on nuclear submarine construction and ordered the Pentagon to hand in a report that assesses its implications for Indo-Pacific security until February next year. The expert added that this shows how stalled talks are now making progress.
Recent Vice Minister-level talks reaffirmed both sides' commitment to advancing bilateral security cooperation. And this shows how the recent talks paved the way for more substantive discussions on a nuclear-powered submarine project and on the possible revision of the nuclear agreement.
Still, it is unclear how the committee will approach sensitive issues like nuclear fuel supply after the Pentagon review. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
South Korea will face Mexico on Friday morning Korea time with a match that could decide Group A. Now, all eyes are on whether the Taeguk Warriors can build on the win over Czechia last week. Our Park Tae-ryung tells us more.
South Korea's second group stage match against Mexico is just 1 day away. A win would give the country its first ever World Cup victory over Mexico in 3 meetings, while putting them in a strong position to finish top of Group A. But with Mexico considered the strongest team in the group and enjoying home advantage, it'll be far from easy. Still, South Korea's head coach Hong Myung-bo sounded calm.
We are facing the strongest team in our group. And as we've all experienced before, playing against a home team presents even greater difficulties, but we will prepare well so that our players can overcome those challenges and play well tomorrow.
The match could ultimately be decided by South Korea's ability to break through Mexico's high press. If Korea can escape the pressure, Mexico's aggressive attacking shape could leave space behind, giving players like Lee Gang-in, Hwang In-beom, and Son Heung-min the chance to create decisive moments. One thing that stands out in South Korea's World Cup campaign is its sports psychologist. For the first time, a neuropsychiatrist has joined the national team's medical staff. Han Duk-hyun, who has 25 years of experience, says he and Hong have discussed in detail how to communicate with the players before each match. He described the players' mindsets as calm, adding that the team is psychologically well prepared. The match is expected to bring heavy home support and loud noise from the stands. But many of Korea's players have already experienced even greater crowd pressure in Europe and are unlikely to be shaken by the atmosphere. Park Tae-ryung, Arirang News.
The Korean wave is no longer confined to the digital world. Over in Paris, visitors are getting an immersive look at Korea's culture, with everything from K-food and K-beauty to K-pop on display. Our culture correspondent Park Kwon-woo has the story.
To get a bowl of Korean ramen and tteokbokki, you need to join a long queue in France. At least that's the case this week at K-Expo, being held as Korea and France celebrate 140 years of diplomatic ties.
One of the fastest ways to understand a culture is through its food. And here at the K-Expo, people just don't see Korea, they taste it. From instant tteokbokki, spicy ramen, to seafood specialties from Korea's coastlines, this food zone is bringing Korean flavors straight to Paris.
We can experience really, I think, the whole culture. I feel like there's more and more exhibitions and fair about Korea, mostly in Paris, but maybe it should be not only in Paris.
Demand was so high that some food booths ran out of products hours before closing time. At the beauty zone, visitors lined up to try Korean skincare products and receive personalized consultations.
If I wake up tomorrow and my skin feels good, I will try to find the product or a similar one. There's a lot of shop in Paris, so it's really easy to find the K-beauty products here.
The energy continued in the evening with the K-pop concert featuring 6 acts, including Monsta X and NCT Wish, drawing thousands of fans. A2 Major also held a mini fan meeting, giving fans a chance to meet the group up close.
I tried my chance to go to the fan sign, but sadly I wasn't selected. So I just like came here to see them because even though I wasn't chosen since I really like them a lot. I just seeing them is already like a lot for me.
For organizers, the event is about creating stronger cultural ties between the two countries.
I hope this serves as an opportunity for young people in France to gain a deeper understanding of Korean culture beyond what they've seen so far. As the government and private sector continue to expand exchanges, I believe that by the time we celebrate the 150th anniversary, Korea and France will feel less like distant countries and more like close neighbours.
The cultural exchange is also generating business opportunities. Organizers have set a business consultation target of $400 million, connecting Korean companies with European buyers and turning cultural interest into economic opportunity. Business meetings continue through Friday as Korea looks to further expand the global reach of K-culture into business partnerships. 박건우, Arirang News, Paris.
Despite the approaching rain, midsummer-like heat will continue, with temperatures once again climbing above 30 degrees Celsius tomorrow. Korea is scheduled to face Mexico tomorrow in its second Group A match of the World Cup. If you're planning to head to theme park events across the country, be sure to take precautions against the heat and stay hydrated. As the heat continues to build day by day, heatwave alerts are being expanded across more areas. As of 2 p.m. today, heatwave advisories have been extended to parts of Seoul. This marks Seoul's first heat advisory of the year, arriving 12 days earlier than last year. Tomorrow, skies will be mostly cloudy nationwide, with rain or scattered showers expected in many areas. Including Seoul, most areas will see around 5 to 30 millimeters of rainfall. Tomorrow morning will also feel somewhat muggy, with temperatures remaining above 20 degrees Celsius in most areas. Seoul will start the day at around 22 degrees, Daejeon at 21 degrees, Busan at 21 degrees as well. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 32 degrees, Daegu at 31 degrees, Jeju at 26 degrees. Rain is forecast across much of the country on Saturday, bringing some relief from the heat. That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
저희 누나가 발레를 하다 보니까 자연스럽게 누나 발레 학원에 따라가서 누나가 하는 모습을 보니까 저도 하고 싶다고 생각이 조금 들어서 발레 음악에 맞춰서 아무 춤이나 추다 보니까 그냥 그 음악에 맞춰서 제가 몸을 움직이는 게 재밌다고 느껴졌었는지 발레를 계속 하고 있더라고요. 나이가 좀 어릴 때 제가 가진 장점이 무엇인지도 모르고 아예 제가 가진 단점도 모를 때 발레를 시작했다 보니까 제일 큰 문제가 이제 평발이었던 것 같아요. 평발이다 보니까 발레를 할 때 쥐가 조금 많이 나는 편이라 그거를 견뎌가면서 춤을 계속 춰야 했던 거 그게 가장 극복하기 힘들었던 것 같고요. 제가 다리가 다른 친구들보다 조금 두껍다고 해서 제 다리를 조금 싫어했었는데 근데 이제 로잔에 갔다 오고 나서 오히려 제 다리에서 나오는 파워풀한 힘이 좋았다고 해주시는 분들도 있다는 걸 느껴가지고 그 두 개가 가장 극복하기도 힘들었고 기억에 남는 것 같아요. 프릭스티 로잔이라는 콩쿨 자체가 학생들 사이에서는 가장 크고 의미 있는 콩쿨이다 보니 제가 그 로잔 영상을 보면서 자라왔기 때문에 그 무대에 서서 제가 춤을 췄다는 것 자체가 엄청 인상 깊었던 것 같아요. 제가 걸어왔던 길, 이게 맞는 방법일까? 근데 그런 의구심을 다 없앨 수 있게 제가 가는 길이 맞았다라는 거를 확인시켜줬던 것 같아요. 그래서 그런 감정이 들어서 조금 감격스러웠던 것 같아요. 한 배역에만 잘 할 수 있는 명수가 아니라 어떠한 배역을 받아도 다 넣어서 소화해낼 수 있는 그런 스펙트럼이 넓은 명수가 되고 싶습니다.
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Pony Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pinkfong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like the total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imaginations. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gyeon. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has wrapped up his first European tour since taking office, marking a busy 10 days of diplomacy across Belgium, Italy, the Vatican, and France. The trip produced a Korea-EU joint statement, a new digital trade agreement, and an upgrade of ties with Italy to a special strategic partnership. President Lee also used the G7 summit to highlight issues ranging from AI and energy security to peace on the Korean peninsula. So what did Korea gain from this trip, and what does it tell us about Seoul's diplomatic priorities in the second year of the Lee administration? To discuss this, we connect to Andrew Millard, head of international relations at Changwon National University. A very big welcome.
Good evening. Thanks for having me back again.
And also joining us is Hanna Kim, associate professor at Seoul University's GSIS. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me as well.
So let's start a discussion right away. First with Professor Millard. So like I've said, President Lee has now completed his first tour in Europe since taking office. So of all the meetings and agreements that we saw over the period, what stood out to you the most?
Well, this is a good question to start with. So as you mentioned, this is his first trip to Europe, but it's been a long trip. He's been there for 10 days, started off in Brussels, then moved to Italy, the Vatican City. Then he's been in France talking to various different leaders. So it's been a very busy 10 days, lots of meetings, lots of agreements made. I mean, you could really say there's no one specific agreement or meeting that was significantly more important than the others, because they've all been slightly different in different areas. But he definitely started off in Brussels, meeting with the European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the European Council President Antonio Costa. And when they were in Brussels, I think, as you mentioned before, they signed this new digital trade agreement. Now, this is very important because this is with the European Union. So it's not just one country, it's with 27 countries. So it's therefore a very significant, very broad agreement. But what this shows is that South Korea and the European Union, they have an ever closer relationship developing. They're really developing trust, because under this trade agreement, this digital agreement, it's really about the sharing of information, about data. So there has to be very strong trust between them. So I think that's very significant for that one. But they also talked about defense. There were some trade issues, talking about Korean steel and how the EU is going to implement increased tariffs against steel coming in. So they were discussing those. But then after that, as you said, he did go to Italy. And with Italy, they had this special strategic agreement. So this one also very significant. He also went to the Vatican, mentioned North Korea and how to promote peace on the Korean Peninsula. So again, very important issues there. But then again, in the G7, he was meeting with the US, Canada, Germany's Met. So all of these different leaders, some of them more informal, some of them more formal, but discussing various different agreements. So with Canada, really promoting South Korea's defense industries, and then also clean energy, AI, digital, semiconductors, and various things. So also with Italy was also bio, aerospace as well. So again, lots of meetings, lots of agreements. Can we really say that out of all of those, one was much more important than the others? In my opinion, we can't. They were all very important, but what they really show is that South Korea and Europe especially are now really developing very strong, very close relationships in all different areas.
Right, indeed. So it really seems the trip produced both diplomatic and economic outcomes across several fronts, of course. Now, one of the things that Professor Millard has pointed out was the Korea-EU summit, which produced this 36-point joint statement and a new digital trade agreement as well. Professor Kim, how significant are these kinds of achievements for South Korea?
Right, so this summit carried more weight than the headline number suggests. It was the 11th Korea-EU summit. It was held with Council President Antonio Costa and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the EU Council headquarters in Brussels. And what makes the timing significant is the gap behind it. Right? This marked the first bilateral visit by a Korean president to the EU in 8 years. And 8 years is roughly the span in which US-China tensions, the war in Ukraine, the global supply chain realignment reshaped the entire international landscape. So this means that both sides are essentially, they had to rebuild trust and reset the agenda almost from scratch. And so the result of this summit, as you mentioned, produced this 36-article joint statement covering trade and investment, economic security, security and defense, science and technology, climate and energy, and global affairs. And so the breadth of this statement suggests that this isn't a ceremonial document. It's something much closer to a working roadmap
for the relationship between the two actors within the next several years. And so within this, the digital trade agreement stands out the most as the most concrete deliverable. Striking a digital trade framework with the world's largest single market gives Korean firms a more predictable footing on data flows, e-commerce, and AI-related regulation going forward. So this is through the granular provisions of the agreement weren't detailed, but I'd like to kind of see the practical scope as still emerging regarding this. And so on balance, this summit is a rare case where symbolism in the context of ending an 8-year gap in the relationship and substance, this 36 points plus signed agreement really landed in the same room at the same time.
Right. It was indeed a milestone we were seeing. Now, beyond this outcomes, actually, the Lee administration has said that it wants to play a more active role in shaping global issues. Professor Miller, do you think this latest trip had reflected that kind of a shift?
I think in a way we can say yes, because as we have mentioned, this trip, it did cover so many different areas. It wasn't just a basic trade sort of agreement trip to develop trade relations. It was very specific. However, just because a country wants to have more of a global role doesn't mean it will or does have a global role. So actually South Korea, we could say it's in a sort of a bit of a gray area, to 애매한 area, because it's not yet a fully global power. I don't know if it ever will be, but it's much more than just a middle power. It's a very strong middle power. So it definitely has the potential in several areas where it can play a global role in the future. Is it doing it now? For that, really, that requires recognition of South Korea's influence in AI, in digitalization, in defense, and so on and so on. Now, where South Korea does have a few different strengths right now is, first one is in technology and technological governance. So we know from last year when South Korea had the rotating presidency of the Security Council, President Lee was pushing for Korea to become a leader in AI regulation. So this one is something that he can continue on, but also cybersecurity and all of these other areas, semiconductors. South Korea doesn't just have to be a developer and manufacturer, it can now play a leading role in creating and setting global norms, global standards, rules in these areas. So it has that area. And another reason that it can do this is because South Korea, we can argue, especially at the moment through pragmatic diplomacy, it's not aligned with one specific country. It's friends with Europe, as we're seeing, also with North America. It's friends with China. So it can play this sort of role of influencing various different countries as well. And then in other areas, norms-based. So President Lee last week mentioned that he wants South Korea to become a norms-based power. So again, this means he's not aligning with one specific system. So again, this gives them more range and more influence.
Right, definitely. Now, if we turn a little bit to the economy, cooperation was a major focus throughout the trip, of course, from trade to AI and advanced technologies as well. Professor Kim, which area do you think is likely to bring the biggest benefits for us all?
So if we think about the areas of trade, AI, and advanced technology, I think the answer really depends largely on the time frame that we're thinking about or we're talking about. In the short term, the digital trade agreement is likely to generate the most visible and measurable benefits. It builds on the existing Korea-EU FTA framework, and it provides greater predictability in areas such as data flows, e-commerce, and broader digital governance. And because it expands on an already established economic relationship, implementation can move relatively quickly and deliver practical benefits for businesses. But in the long term, AI and advanced technology cooperation may prove to be more consequential. Throughout the Europe trip, the Korean government repeatedly emphasized closer cooperation with leading economies in sectors such as semiconductors, AI, aerospace, biotechnology, and energy. And these are areas that are expected to shape future economic competitiveness, and deeper cooperation here would strengthen Korea's position in emerging industries and technology standards. And in addition to this, the reason many analysts pay close attention to AI and frontier technologies is because international rules and standards governing these sectors are still evolving. So for Korea, the opportunity is not simply to participate in existing markets, but also to strengthen its influence in shaping future technology or technological ecosystems alongside advanced economies. With that being said, AI and advanced technology cooperation is inherently a long-term project. So it really depends on which time frame we're looking at.
Right, so it's really beyond just opportunities, and we will be looking for some tangible results from this latest visit as well. Now, Professor Kim, defense cooperation was another key theme during the trip. How much potential do you see for Korea's defense industry in Europe?
So I do see considerable long-term potential here, but I would characterize this trip as more about building foundations than securing immediate defense contracts. And one of the most significant developments that was Korea and the EU's agreement to begin negotiations on a security of information agreement. So on the surface, that may sound technical, but it is actually quite important. And a legal framework for protecting and sharing sensitive information makes deeper security cooperation and defense industrial collaboration much easier. And this is not going to produce defense exports on its own, but it helps create the institutional conditions that make more advanced forms of cooperation possible. And this matters because defense cooperation increasingly depends not only on weapons systems themselves, but also, I think this was mentioned earlier, on information sharing, technology protection, cybersecurity, and joint research. And so establishing agreed rules in these areas can strengthen trust and facilitate future collaboration between Korea and European partners. And the broader context of this is also very favorable. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many European countries have increased defense spending and have been looking to diversify their sources of military equipment. And that's created opportunities for external suppliers like South Korea. And Korea's defense industry has already demonstrated that it can compete successfully in Europe. Poland was the clearest example, where Korean defense systems gained traction because they combined competitive pricing, strong performance, and relatively rapid delivery schedules. And this showed that European countries are willing to consider Korean suppliers when those suppliers can meet urgent operational requirements. So even though there was no major defense export contract that emerged directly from this trip, it was still a breakthrough in this sense.
Thank you for that, Professor Kim. Now, when we turn to North Korean issues, President Lee used this trip to rally international support for his policy, but Pyongyang has shown quite a little interest in dialogue, apparently. Professor Millett, can international backing actually help bring North Korea back to the table?
I think if we look at it realistically, right now, it's not really going to do too much to change. Because if we look at, in terms of the international backing, nothing has really changed. Most of the countries that were supporting it are still supporting it. The biggest change has really been North Korea's developing relation with Russia and arguably with China as well, and that sort of trilateral partnership developing, but especially North Korea, Russia. And so even though President Lee was over in Europe, will this really support or change anything in terms of North Korea? I don't think so, because right now the Europeans are very much anti-Russian, and Russians very close to North Korea. So I don't think North Korea would do anything to jeopardize its relationship with Russia. And so nothing has really changed on that area. But I think the Europeans in general do support North Korea coming back to the table.
Right, so a very cautious stance from North Korea, but President Lee's brief exchange with President Trump also drew quite a lot of attention. Could you explain for us what kind of significance could we attach to that interaction?
So So actually, there were a couple of different interactions. The first one was, I think the key word you said was brief. So in the photo, the group photo, I think they talked for maybe about a minute. But President Lee was very strategic, introduced himself, said hello, but then also said, oh, President Trump, you've solved the problem in the Middle East. Now come and solve the problem in the Korean Peninsula. So this is really playing to Donald Trump's slightly more narcissistic side, getting into his good books in this just brief interaction. And so later on, when they had the dinner, and then when they were sat next to each other, this is when they're getting off on a good foot already. But 90 minutes when they can really have some informal dialogue. This is really where the relationships are built. So the official signing ceremonies, the summits and so on, things get signed and so on, but that's more symbolic. The relationships happen in the dinners, in the lunches, in the coffee breaks. And so actually the dinner was very important to discuss various different issues. I mean, let's face it, I don't think they were talking about the soup or looking forward to the chocolate cake. They were definitely talking about security in North Korea and shipbuilding, those issues. But very significantly, hopefully developing a good relationship. And for Donald Trump, that is very, very important.
Right, definitely. And we will be looking for some of those results tomorrow. By tomorrow, we hear. Now, finally, Professor Kim, when you look at this trip as a whole, do you think it was able to deliver more symbolic value or some concrete gains?
I wouldn't necessarily frame this as a choice between the two, but what makes this trip noteworthy is that it was a combination of both. Now, the symbolic value was substantial. This was the new administration's first major European tour, the first state visit by a Korean president to Italy in 26 years, and the first visit by a Korean president to EU institutions in 8 years. And the trip also included participation in the G7 summit and an audience with the Pope. And each of those events carried diplomatic significance in its own right and signaled a renewed Korean commitment to engagement with Europe. But at the same time, the trip also produced a number of tangible outcomes. The most important were the comprehensive Korea-EU joint statement covering a broad range of policy areas and the signing of the Korea-EU digital trade agreement. And in addition to this, Korea and the EU agreed to begin negotiations on a security of information agreement, and Korea and Italy also upgraded their relationship to a special strategic partnership. And so, there are both sides to this, but that being said, it's important to not overstate the immediate impact of these achievements, since a lot of these are still ongoing and in the very early stages. So it's not an unusually balanced, it is an unusually balanced diplomatic trip in this regard.
Right. So one thing clear would be that this trip actually helped us and gained excitement to look onto the second year of the Lee administration's foreign policy, of course. I'm afraid we'll have to conclude our discussion here tonight. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kim.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Millard, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.